Welcome to this lesson on variation. So this lesson falls within the unit which is all about evolution and natural selection, and we need to understand that evolution and natural selection works by selecting individuals from a varied population. So that's why we're looking at variation today. It's going to be a little bit mathsy in parts, and to start with you'll need to have printed out the slide which I'm going to send on Teams. It'll be the first slide of the PowerPoint. And you may also need some graph paper if you have access to it. If not, you can work with line paper. So let's begin. Our aim is to understand the sources and types of variation. And the first thing I'd like you to do is to think about features that are controlled by genes and inheritance and features that are controlled by environmental features. Pause the video, make two lists and see how many different features you can get which are influenced by either genetics or environment. Okay, off you go. All right. So here are a few more. Perhaps you got stuck. You could add these if you didn't get add these into your different columns if you weren't sure. So pause if you want to. But here is how we categorize these. So can swim. Okay, that's obviously an environmental feature. Blood group, that's purely inherited or genetic. Natural hair color, again, that's purely genetic, as well as eye color as well. Having a tattoo is an environmental feature, obviously. Language spoken is environmental. You don't inherit that from your parents. It's caused by the environment that you're brought up in when you're learning language as a small infant. Now, height and skin tone, you would put sort of in between. So many features are influenced by both environmental and genetic factors. For example, height, you might have genes that mean you could grow to be a very high person, very tall person, but if you don't get the right nutrition throughout your life, you're not going to reach that height. Likewise, skin tone. You have genes from your parents that determine sort of your base level of skin tone. But sun exposure can, of course, cause your skin tone to change. Whether you have less sun exposure, your skin gets a bit lighter. More sun exposure, your skin gets a bit darker. So to go further and explain one of these two features and how they're affected by both, could you write a sentence explaining this? Okay, so pick one or the other and write a sentence along the lines of what I've put here at the bottom. Off you go. Okay, so let's look at variation a bit more. So everyone in this picture is human. However, within this group of people, there's a lot of variation. There's a lot of variation between all these humans, and all these humans are members of the same species. So we would say that this is variation, and this is also intra-specific variation in one species. Let's look at some of the variation that we have as humans. Okay, so you can do this along. Which one do you have? This is a bit of fun. So first of all, widow's peak. Do you have a widow's peak or not? I think I do. Kind of my hairline goes down a little bit in the middle, so I do have widow's peak. That is a genetically controlled feature. Mid-digit hair. Do you have hair sort of on your hands, in between your digits, or not? I don't think I do. Attached earlobes or free earlobes. So do they sort of hang down or do they go straight in? I think I have free earlobes. Left thumbed or right thumbed, if you put your hands together like this, clasp your hands, and then you look here, my right thumb is on top, so I'm right thumbed. And that is, interestingly, that's apparently genetically controlled. Dimples or no dimples? Smile? I don't have dimples. As much as I smile, I don't have them, so that's me. Can roll tongue, cannot roll tongue? I can roll my tongue. Again, a genetically controlled trait. So all those things are genetically controlled. Let's pause there and go to the syllabus. So here's what the syllabus says about different types of variation. There's a lot of stuff to do with variation, and we're actually going to split this into two lessons. So today, all I want to be able to do is to kind of know the terms intraspecific and interspecific, and to understand the difference between continuous and discontinuous variation. We're also going to look at genes and environment. We've kind of already done that. And we're going to use standard deviation to measure the spread of a set of data. The statistics bit below, we're going to leave for next lesson. So next lesson, we're going to be using some statistics to compare varied populations using both the Spearman's correlation coefficient and also the student's t-test. All right, another quick activity. Can you match these three famous fathers with their three relatively famous children? And even if you don't know who these are, I've actually forgotten who some of them are, can you figure it out? Off you go, see if you can match them up. Well, okay, here we go. Johnny Ball and Zoe Ball, John Lennon and Julian Lennon, and Kirk Douglas and Michael Douglas. Now, how did you do this? How did you get on? Well, you were able to match the parents to the progeny, that's their children, not only through similarities but also through differences. So these similarities and differences within a species are known as intraspecific variation. So this intraspecific, I want to write that down, intraspecific variation. This intraspecific variation is the variation within a species, and this relies upon mutations that exist in a species. The variation may be acted upon by selective pressures, and eventually only the fittest individuals will survive to breed. So this is the way that evolution via natural selection operates, and we're going to look at the mechanisms for this in more detail in a lesson in about 2 lessons time. So underneath here I've got a picture of some different pigeons. So this shows some variation within one species. These are all pigeons. And I think actually a lot of these pigeons are bred specifically for their kind of traits that humans have caused them to be like this. But let's just imagine that all these pigeons are out and about flying around London. Now some of these pigeons will be less adapted to survive and some will be more adapted. And actually there are quite a lot of predators, peregrine falcons flying about in London that will try and eat these pigeons. And maybe we can imagine that some pigeons in this image here will be more camouflaged and others won't be. So you might get natural selection operating on this varied population. What about interspecific variation? Now really focus on the difference between intra, which means in one species, and inter, which is between different species. So interspecific variation is differences between, for example, a zebra and a horse, or a grizzly bear and a polar bear. So sometimes it can be a bit difficult to spot the variation, to really distinguish, but here we've obviously got fur colour, slightly different head shape, and that sort of thing enables us to distinguish grizzly bears from polar bears. Another example, killer whale versus blue whale. So that's interspecific variation. Okay, so we've covered intra versus inter. What about the difference between continuous and discontinuous? Coming on to that in the next slide. So variation overall is the existence of variety and differences within and between species. So this could be, surface features, but it may also be going deeper, sort of features that are not easily discernible from the outside. So it might be kind of internal features, or even behaviors. So organisms show variation in their behaviors. For example, their breeding season or the type of calls they make, and all sorts of things like that. Okay, so now let's get into a bit more of the maths of things. What are the types of variation mathematically? Well, mathematically, we can either say that variation is continuous or discontinuous. These are two statements that you're going to need to write down. So continuous variation is a variation that is smooth, and it kind of falls along a line, or maybe it falls along a range. So this means that some feature, for example, height, can take any value along a range and any intermediate value. So for example, you could be, this graph here shows height in inches, so you could be 61 or 61 and a half or 67 and a half, 71.5, etc. Any value along a range. Now, discontinuous variation, this is variation that can only be one of a few set categories, and there are no in-between values. For example, blood group, human blood group, you can only be A, B, AB, or O, if we're talking about this specific way of looking at blood groups. So there's only 4 categories, and you can't be sort of O/AB. There's no intermediate values. So I've given you two examples there, height and blood group. Can you now think of three or more examples of continuous and discontinuous variation? So can you think of some other things that would be continuous and some other things that would be discontinuous? Put those examples in underneath your notes from this page. Pause the video and come back in a few seconds. Okay, so continuous variation, here are some examples. Height, weight, arm length, length of a leaf of a plant, length of a stalk of a plant, number of flagella on bacteria. Remember, the flagella are kind of like little wavy things that actually spin like this, round, 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 that power bacteria to make it zoom along. Discontinuous variation, for example, eye color, earlobe shape, or lots of those things that we looked at earlier. For example, blood group, we've already seen that one. Biological sex, so this is biologically determined sex in terms of chromosomes, or the presence or absence of flagella, to give another bacterial example. Those are discontinuous variation examples. So now we're going to go on and do a bit more work about continuous variation. So just to develop the maths of this a bit further, we can say that continuous variation, there's the full range of variables between two extremes. So like I said before, anywhere along a sort of spectrum. And data is normally presented in a normal distribution. Okay, so let's unpack that term. What is a normal distribution or a bell-shaped curve? If you've done maths before, if you're doing this in Maths A-Level, this will be familiar, but it might not be for some people. So you've got a sheet of paper that has these heights on it. So this is actually some data which I took from some students a number of years ago at a different school, and we measured everyone's height. Okay, so I had 25 students, but some were missing. Student 10, 15, 20, and 24 were absent that day. And we measured the heights of all these students in centimetres, and I wrote them down here on the board. This was a screen grab from that time. I think this bottom one here, by the way, is 156. So what I'd like you to do is to put a table like this into your book, and I would like you to figure out how many students there were that fell between 140 and 145 centimetres, how many students between 146 and 150, 151 to 155, and so on. So write in the number of pupils in each of those height categories. Okay, so use the sheet which you've printed out, we'll rewind the video, and fill out this table. Pause this video and come back to me in a minute. Okay, so here were the numbers. These are the numbers that I got. Okay, so I got just one student in this range, 4 here, 7, 3, and 2. So I'd like you to plot this information now as a histogram, which is basically a bar chart. It's going to look a bit like that, okay, but I want you actually to plot it accurately. So take a piece of graph paper if you can. If not, you can do it in your book. So you're going to have the height along the x-axis, and you're going to have the number of pupils along the y-axis, okay? So you're going to include a picture of that on Teams when you send this lesson to me, okay? So pause this video and complete that now, please. So your histogram will look a bit like this. Now, this was a class, I think, of 21 pupils. Now, with 21 pupils, the histogram looks a bit blocky. Okay, it's not a perfect smooth curve. What if we looked at the whole year group? Okay, so if we had looked at the whole year group of this year 7 class as opposed to just one class, the data would start to look a bit more smooth like that. So what if instead of looking at the whole year group of one school, maybe we looked at all the students in one borough, like borough of Southwark, for example? Well, then we'd get even more smooth data that would start to look like this. And maybe if we started to look at the data for the number of students across the whole year, across the whole of London, we get data that looks more and more sort of smooth. So we find that as we do bigger and bigger and bigger samples, we get a distribution that becomes more kind of perfectly smooth. We call this the normal distribution. So normal distribution is the pattern of distribution that we typically see in biology, okay? Many features show this normal distribution, and in fact we can pretty much assume that most things that we want to measure in biology are normally distributed. We can make that assumption, especially at A-level, we can assume that. So examples of normal distribution in biology might be birth weight of babies. It might be distribution of pizza delivery times. So, especially if this is a biologically powered delivery, someone's cycling, some people are going to be very fast cycling and some people are going to be slower cycling, and we'd expect it to be normally distributed around there. Another thing even, this is kind of hatchling weight, not of babies, but of amphipods. So this is the weight of amphipod hatchlings in micrograms, and that's pretty much normally distributed. So we need to know some points about this. So you're going to have to copy this graph and label it with what I'm about to reveal. So the normal distribution is determined by an average, okay, an average. So the middle is the mean or average, and we give that the symbol mu. So mu means the average or the mean. Then we have this symbol sigma. So this is a sigma, and we can show that, sigma is the standard deviation. So standard deviation is a measure of how spread the distribution is. So if something has a big standard deviation, it's kind of quite flat like that. And if something has a smaller standard deviation, it's kind of more narrowly distributed. So we can define that normal distribution by the central point, the mean, and then the spread, which is the standard deviation. And for any normally distributed thing, we can say that 68.2% of individuals lie within one standard deviation of the mean. 95.4% of individuals lie within 2 standard deviations of the mean, and within 3 standard deviations of the mean, 99.7% of individuals lie within 3 standard deviations of the mean. Okay, so basically that says that, most, if we're talking about, let's say, student height, most of those students in year 7, if we looked at the whole year group perhaps, most of the students in year 7 would be quite close to the mean, with only a few students that were quite a lot shorter than average and a few students that were quite a lot taller than average. So that is normal distribution. Right. So how do we calculate these values, the mean and the standard deviation? Well, mean is simple. I'm pretty sure you should know how to do that. You should have done that in GCSE maths. So quickly pause the video and say it out loud. How do you calculate the mean? Okay, so yeah, that's right. You basically take all the values, you sum them up, and then you divide by the number of individuals you are looking at. What about standard deviation? Okay, so the formula for standard deviation is given here. This is a formula that you need to write down, and you need to know how to calculate this for the exam. Okay, I'm going to do a little review about some of the formula you need to know later on, which formula you need to know, which formula you need to be given. I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but I would try and remember this for the time being. But you do need to know how to calculate. So let's look at it. So S, the standard deviation, or sometimes given the symbol sigma, as we saw before. It is, well, you have to square root a thing first. So this is square root, and you have to sum these values. So x is the value minus x bar, which is the mean, and then we have to square that, and we have to also divide it by n. So this can also sometimes be written using different symbols. So we might also use the symbol mu for the mean instead of x bar. So let's work this out. Let's go through a practice example of this, and you're going to need to use the sheet, which you should have printed already. So here's the sheet. First thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to calculate the mean of all these values by summing them up, and then you're going to divide it by 21, because there's 21 students here, because remember, this student, this one, and this one were not there. So pause the video and calculate the mean, and write it down somewhere around the outside. Maybe write it just above this word mean here. Okay, pause. Okay, did you work out the mean? You should have got something like that. I got 3,283 divided by 21. I got 156.3, but I just rounded that to 156 because it's easier to work with. So there's the mean. Now you're going to work out this column. So what is the value minus the mean? So for student number 1, the student was 157 centimeters tall and the mean was 156. So 157 take away 156 is 1. That's going to be the first value you write down. Pause the video and calculate the rest of this column. Off you go. So that column should work out about like this. Next thing you've got to do is pause the video once I've finished, and you have to square each one of these values. And what you're doing really is you're just getting rid of the sign, because if you square either a negative or a positive number, it's going to get rid of the minus sign and make all the values positive. So go ahead and do that. Square all the values and fill in the next column. Okay, have you done that? Here's what I get. So there's all my numbers. Okay, so we're getting there. Next thing we've got to do is we've got to add up all those. Okay, so get your calculator and add up all these values and write it in this box here. Once you've done that, you do 2 more things. So then you divide it by the number of values, which is 21, and then you do the square root of that. That's going to give you the value for the standard deviation. And we can think of the standard deviation as sort of like, it's kind of like, on average, how far away is a student from the mean value in height? That's what it kind of is. Pause the video and we'll see if you get the same answer as me. Okay, so the standard deviation there I worked out as being about 6.4. I had 853 for the sum, 40.6 when I divided by 21, and 6.4 for my standard deviation value. So that means on average, those students in the class were around about, an average student in the class was about 6.4 centimeters off the mean on average. Okay, so now let's just review the summary questions from the textbook page there. And you'll need to look at the textbook because there's a picture of some rabbits there which you need to look at. So pause this video, answer these questions, and then come back to me once you've answered them and we'll green pen. Here are the answers. Green pen this work, send it to me on Teams, please, making sure that you're aware of any key vocabulary. And before we go, we'll just review the syllabus points that we've looked at today. So we looked at these points, and remember we focused really on this stuff. We talked about intraspecific, interspecific, continuous and discontinuous variation. We plotted a histogram to show continuous variation of a class. And then we also calculated the standard deviation to measure the spread of the heights of that class, which was roughly normally distributed. Okay, so next lesson is going to get even a bit more mathsy. We're going to do a student's t-test and a Spearman's rank correlation coefficient. Okay, so get your maths brains ready for that next lesson. Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye.